Wow, what a glorious music. That's that shows you guys all made it to the right room, the best choice. So welcome to the stage one, pandemics and planetary health. This is our third core conversation for the whole seminar. And I am so honored to introduce our two alumni experts today. Our first alumni is Dr. James Spencer. He is a vice provost and dean at the Louisiana State University Graduate School and international urbanization and planning specialist. And our second guest is Dr. Victoria Fan, Associate Professor of Health Policy and Interim Director at Center on Aging at the School of Thompson School of Social Work and Public Health at the University of Hawaii. And it's dear to my heart because this is my program, and Dr. Fan is one of my favorite professors who helped me to write a better grant. So I'm so honored to have you here today, and we give you the stage to lead the most interesting conversation. All
Great.
right.
So I'll just jump in. And first off, let me say thank you to the East West Center Alumni Association and everyone involved at East West Center with putting this together. I spent 12 years as a professor and faculty member at the University of Hawaii, and it was 12 of the best years of my life, and in part because of all the great cultural and intellectual and social events that the East West Center put together. And as Victoria said, we're going to sort of talk a lot about the context of global pandemics right now, which is very relevant. So you're in the right place. You're in the place where you're going to learn the most. And I will say that my expertise, the East West Center played a very, very sort of core role in developing this expertise, dating back from about 2004 or so, when I partnered with the East West Center, Jeff Fox and Sumit Saxena and Melissa Finucane at the time, to develop a project for the NSF National Science Foundation, US, on coupled human natural systems that was looking at agricultural intensification, habitat alteration, and urbanization as the drivers of, at the time, the global pandemic that everybody was worried about was avian influenza. And if you recall, there had been SARS in 2003, and then maybe 2 or 3 years later, there's a big scare with avian influenza in Vietnam, Cambodia, Thailand, a little bit in southern China as well. And so it kickstarted this whole conversation about what the medical fields and the public health and the animal health folks call the category of emerging infectious diseases, which are those diseases that transmit from animals over into humans. And so, there's thousands of infectious diseases that are affecting our wild animals and livestock. And every once in a while, the conditions are created where the genes from those viruses are able to get into the human bodies and then transfer from human to human to human. And that's exactly what COVID-19 is. And if you hear the popular press about it, and Anthony Fauci and all the other medical side talking there, it's zoonotic diseases. And so the East West Center and our team was very much at the forefront of this starting in 2004, where we spent a long time bringing together experts from animal health, human health, social sciences, statistics, and geography together to assemble a massive data set to really look at why this disease was happening and where, and using the case of Vietnam. So it was the kind of project that really was filling an empirical gap, because medical scientists had been saying for years, in my particular interest in urbanization, that urbanization was driving the growth of emerging infectious disease, but they had no data on it. They had no analysis. So our project was one of the first to really provide data on the impact that intensifying agriculture and intensifying urbanization without the proper controls was actually demonstrably related to the geography of the outbreaks of avian influenza. Now, all that to say that that was sort of for a pandemic that actually never occurred, right? So there was a lot of concern about avian influenza at the time. And what we found was that it was occurring in places where you had very sort of rapid growth in things like subcontracting in the agricultural economy to, sort of chicken stock, where, they were transforming household farms into small industry farms, right? At the same time, you had rapid urbanization without the growth of appropriate infrastructure to maintain sanitation. So you had all these conditions where humans were very close to chickens and pigs, and they were exchanging viruses very easily. And so it was natural in those environments that you had the emergence of avian influenza, an emerging infectious disease. Again, fortunately, it didn't go anywhere beyond Vietnam or beyond Southeast Asia, because it was very difficult to transmit from human to human. Now, that was something that was very interesting and important at the time, but like many research projects, the funding ran out, and we kind of just sort of kept an eye on it. In August of 2019, this is an interesting follow-up. Sumit Saxena at the East West Center and I wrote a follow-up to NSF called Beyond Smart Cities, a system of global urban health intelligence. And it basically outlines exactly the scenario that happened in December 2019 and in the US in, I think, probably about January, February 2020, which was the emergence of an emerging infectious disease that could transmit very easily from human to human. And suddenly we found the world engulfed in this uh, problem that on the medical side, many of the epidemiologists had been talking about this for a long time. What I think the East West Center took the lead on, that we were part of as a team, was to say it's not just a medical question, right? There are things that we can do related to other social science, land use planning, human and animal interaction management that can help mitigate this risk. So with that, that's just sort of an entry point into sort of what my kind of perspective on this is, and its relation to the East West Center.
Thank you for those remarks, Jim. Aloha and welcome, everybody. It's really an honor and pleasure to be here this Saturday afternoon. And I want to just wish everyone good morning, good day, good evening to everybody around the world. And I'm just so grateful that you've joined us for this session, for this hopefully organic conversation. For me, the center is really about connections, connecting with each other, connecting about ideas, and really connecting to a broader purpose and a global good. So our session, is entitled Pandemics and Planetary Health. And for me, as I reflect, and I think Jim has already done a fantastic job reflecting on these interdependence and similarities, I thought I'd just sort of reflect a little bit more about how climate change specifically and COVID are interdependent and also very similar to each other in these challenges. First off, I think climate change specifically and COVID are risks that are severely underestimated. I think that's because they're rare, or they appear, I think, mistakenly very far into the future. But they're as we all very much know from this pandemic, their potential economic and health losses are just enormous. And in fact, our 2017 paper with Dean Jameson and Larry Summers about pandemic losses really emphasized this point about it being a very undervalued risk. I think both of the challenges appear vague and sort of intangible in concept, partly because they're rare, but when they actually do hit, they do hit so hard, as we all know from the pandemic. And when I reflect back and looking at our pandemic paper published a few years ago, there was not very much attention paid. And I think the reason for that is because the pandemic as a concept was not really understood by many countries, with a few exceptions of those countries like Jim mentioned, of those battling avian influenza or SARS. But I think now, for better or worse, everyone really knows what a pandemic is. But I wonder, and I actually worry, that if we will also approach planetary health and climate change with that same sense of tangibility and not so vague and not so abstract, and also how are we going to make changes moving into the future regarding to both these challenges. Because of this vagueness or sort of abstract concept of these two things, I think our preparedness against these challenges are also undervalued. So, so much of the negative consequences from this pandemic, I think I would argue, have been potentially avoidable. But somehow we think that by doing nothing different, perhaps, that we will somehow not be subject to the same just devastating fate. And I think this form of ignorance is extremely hard to address and tackle and even communicate. And as Jim was mentioning, climate change, of course, worsened by deforestation, encroachment on wildlife terrains, and so too, these emerging infectious diseases, these zoonotic diseases of animal origin, such as COVID, are worsened by environmental degradation or urbanization. And so I guess you could call climate change and COVID kind of related cousins, so to speak. They're kind of born from similar underlying root causes. Of course, ironically, COVID dampened some of the growth of our CO2 emissions and also let Mother Earth breathe just a little bit in this past year. And here in the US, both Jim and I are in the United States, and I think we also face tremendous battles of misinformation, as our parallel session is talking about, and naysayers against both of these challenges. And so I think that makes the education of our society even more crucial. And I think ignorance during this pandemic has truly been disastrous. It sounds like I'm sort of exaggerating that, but no, I really think ignorance during this pandemic has just been disastrous. And as a scientist myself, I've found that the pandemic is extremely challenging to communicate, but it's also shown me that scientists, more than ever, we have an ethical responsibility to communicate the science locally, being very local, and that if we fail to do so, we may have some disastrous consequences. On the positive side, the pandemic has shown me through governance and also some tools such as forecasting and data science and health analytics. These tools can be used to help inform decision makers. One of our examples here locally, here in Hawaii, we have a Hawaii Pandemic Applied Modeling Work Group. You can check it out, www.hipam.org. And this work group of scientists coming together around this common issue about, hey, what's the COVID count going to be in the next 2 weeks? And what's the impact of the policies that we may impose? What will be their impact? So I think our HIPAM group really gave me a tremendous amount of optimism, despite the overarching just devastation I think that's been wrought. I think also precautionary principle applies to both COVID and climate change. Of course, they both start with the letter C, but in the face of uncertainties, I think choosing a more cautious approach may lead to less overall harm. And this human fault of overconfidence, some may call it arrogance, is certainly exploited by both of these challenges. And also the disproportionate impacts are worsened as a result of COVID and climate change, and inequalities are clearly worsened. And so we do need, a tenacious and an enduring commitment to tackle these inequities. There are so many challenges that both COVID and climate change present. For me, I see two huge challenges. The first is this challenge of collective action and communicating to people that your individual actions do matter. And it sounds so trite to say this, but yes, no place is safe until every place is safe. No person is safe until every person is safe. It's sort of this prisoner's dilemma that we're all facing all together, this world. But has COVID really helped us as a world to reconceive our notion of global citizenship? I'm not sure. I don't necessarily feel that we feel more connected to the world in a sense of one humanity. I'm not sure we're there. Unfortunately, I think we may have gone further to reinforce those divisions and separateness and sort of me first mentality, which is quite dangerous. And then the second challenge, I think, related to that is this concept of human resiliency. And in the face of so much challenges economically, health-wise, but also psychologically, how do we make our minds more resilient? How do we make our emotions more manageable? And also, what is that role of human connection in also making us more resilient? And these are kind of two questions that have been, getting to me and keeping me up at night and wondering how we as a world are really going to move forward to really learn from these lessons. And so I'll stop here.
Yeah. Victoria, it's funny that you sort of end on that point, because it reminds me of some of the other work that I do on inequality. And we've spoken about this and the disproportionate impact of these challenges and the public debate that sort of assumes almost an equal challenge. And talking about sort of the similarities between a global pandemic and global climate change. I mean, one of the similarities is there's an N of one, right? So like there's one world, so you don't have a pattern to look for over time. So you're just kind of it's always going to be an imperfect data environment. But also the relative triage of how that problem is perceived within communities is so different. And I think about this from the global warming side. Being in Hawaii for so long, and then also I spent a lot of time in South Carolina, where you have tremendous, development along the coastline, a very kind of complex wetland coastline that's very much under threat from sea level rise. And for every foot or meter rise, there's a certain $1 trillion impact on the infrastructure. But oftentimes when you talk to people who are from poor communities, you can see that they're not that concerned about that. It's hard to say that they should be, because for them, those are second homes, they're vacation homes, they're the embodiment of wealthy investment. That's the impact. Now, if you go to Bangladesh, it's going to be completely different, and so the dynamics of the communities and their interpretation of the nature of that problem is going to be different. In the same way that it is with the pandemic, and being in Louisiana, where you have a lot of people, I think we're at 30% vaccination rate, not because of a lack of vaccines, but because people just don't want to take them. There's that same perception, right? That this is, yes, it's a problem, but it's not a problem that I want to stick something in my body for. And we can say that it's the scientifically right thing to do. And as a university, we're struggling with this, but there's so many different benchmarks about what the triage of problems are that makes that politics so difficult, and that unity, as you're talking about, at a global scale, so difficult.
Yeah, it's such a good point, Jimmy, and I actually really agree with you. So much is locally dependent about different local or even so-called societal values, and you see how societal values, have played out with regards to specific policy decisions on how countries have responded to COVID, and I think is the answer something as simple as, well, the media, and this is our parallel session here. What's the
Yeah.
role of the media in trying to help to communicate a shared set of values, or not,
Mhm.
especially when so much of the media may have all sorts of, different financial and economic types of incentives. People tend to prefer to watch the media where their values are resonating. We tend not to watch the channels which we don't really fully agree with. And yeah, I think what is the role of our global institutions in trying to, or even places such as the East West Center, for trying to communicate that sense of unity and oneness of this world, this one Earth, one humanity, and we're all in the same boat together. I
Yeah.
think that's such an important role for the East West Center.
Yeah, and I will say that some of the challenges that we're talking about right now is related to sort of the disciplinary approach to these kinds of problems. And the East West, I will say this with a fair amount of confidence. I think the East West Center and similar types of organizations is the solution, and is the solution because being an institution centered on culture and on differences, it values different perspectives in a fundamentally equal way. And of course, there's problems with the way, anything like that. But that's not what you see everywhere. And what I will say is that it sort of bleeds into some of the other concerns that I have on the pandemic side, is that the whole notion of what we should be doing is driven by physicians. And I don't even want to say doctors, because doctors then also includes researchers, but it's mostly driven by people who are clinical kind of people about, how do we kind of manage ourselves to deal with the front end of the problem, not with what is this larger system. And one of the reasons why I think I'm happy that you're involved in all of this, because economists are trained to understand the trade-offs of different choices, right? And so I signed on to a letter to with a bunch of health policy New York people in New York to the incoming administration that they really should rethink the closing of public schools, right? And being very much more deliberate, because the reality from a lot of the public health and the education side was that yes, we should close them because that's going to minimize health risk and transmission. Yet on the other hand, there's a lot of educational impact that that's going to put on our kids. Sorry, this is one of them. Um, that's going to be very negative. And so at the end of the day, our society is not really set up so that we have somebody who is able to speak publicly on the economic consequences of shutting society down. Like Anthony Fauci is a brilliant scientist, but he doesn't really know, he's not in a position to make these trade-offs between, sort of the health consequence and, okay, how many people should we put out of business? Or what is the minimum amount that we need to support people in this period and for how long? I'm sure he contributes to those discussions, productively, but we don't have that same kind of go-to person to sort of look at all these other things that need to be balanced out.
I totally agree with you, Jim. I think for me, the end lesson of all of this is, well, there's many, many lessons, but one of the lessons is, there's siloization, as my colleague Eddie Mercer likes to say, siloization of our disciplines, and a tendency for like-minded people to only talk to other like-minded people, and having physicians talk to only physicians. But when really the pandemic and climate change is a whole nation, all disciplines can contribute. And in our Hawaii pandemic applied modeling work group, I'm really proud to say that we had a little bit of mixture from all these sorts of different fields. We had some folks from health, we had biologists, computer scientists, economists as well, planners, epidemiologists. And I think that addressing the interdisciplinary problem is not something that can be solved by one person, because most people are generally one discipline, generally speaking. And the way to tackle it is through teamwork, which humans are notoriously bad at, I think. And especially, I think even more these days with the way that we have set up our whole, it's so much as individualistic, very, very, very individualistic, very Western value oriented to some extent, and how teamwork can be valued, how interdisciplinary approaches can be valued, I think is a really important area for future development. I don't think even universities, have figured that out well, like teaching students how to think in interdisciplinary ways, work across disciplines. Social workers, I'm in the School of Social Work, I think is very good about potentially doing that. I think that's true for also planners as well. But not all disciplines do that well. And I think that's something to think about. So.
Yeah, I think we're getting close to the time here, but for this session, but I do think, and you and I have spoken a bit about this before, but I think it's really important to, through this whole kind of last year and a half, the whole public debate and our reaction to it has been so reactionary. And in order to get the kind of collaboration to overcome that human nature and the way that society institutionally has developed, that we can't do it overnight, right? We can't do it. We can't learn on Monday that there's a pandemic coming our way and have the plan ready by Thursday, right? We need to start several years in advance. And this is where, sort of I think planning is something that I've always been impressed by the field, by the fact that it thinks about, well, okay, what's going on in 30 years? And there are lessons that we can take, right? So one of the, just simply, we have a 100-year flood plan, right? We calculate the risk of a 100-year flood and develop insurance policies based on that. And we also have it for a 500-year flood. We just had, and we were in the middle of literally the 100-year pandemic, the 100-year global pandemic from 1918 and then 2020. But we don't even think about having those kinds of social and financial mechanisms in place to create a pool of money that can pay everybody to stay home, right? And I noticed somebody in the chat was sort of saying, it's a class-based issue. for many of us, we can work from home. We can do our internet working, but people who have to be in the grocery store, people have to be in delivering Amazon deliveries all day, be in all those places where they're at higher risk. How do we pay them? Where's the money come to pay them to stay home and to do the things that we ask them to do public health wise? But we aren't in a position really where we're thinking about that when it's not happening.
Yeah, it's for me. I see planning as such a valuable tool, but at the same time, planning with urgency is a challenge when these
Yeah.
things again are seem so far off or rare, hard, long
Yeah.
into the future. And fortunately, there's this new G20 report that just came out about financing pandemic risk, and
Yeah.
again, hoping that money can potentially help solve this problem. Although myself, of course, money having the insurance will be very, very supportive, but I also think we have to not only rely on that, and it's so much is about having good systems in place, implementation, and good plans in place. But yeah, it's some balance of the money and the planning, I
Yeah.
think. So
Yeah.
All right. Hi, gang. Well, thank you, Dr. James Spencer from Louisiana State University and Dr. Victoria Fan from University of Hawaii for starting this really great conversation about pandemics. And we will continue this conversation together. So all those who attended this 20 minutes, I hope you learned some interesting new ideas. And now it's time to have a chat about it again. So we will do that by moving into our breakout rooms. Just in a second, you will see a black box pop up on your screen, and it will say words, join the conversation. It will ask you to confirm your video and audio. Just click let's go, and that will magically transport you to your breakout room. So in your room, you will get to meet new friends. These are also your fellow East West Center alumni. And these are totally random. No one is choosing. So this will be a surprise. So when you are in the break room, you will also see questions appear that will help you guide your next discussion. The first question is, what's happening in your community on this topic? Another question is, what's working? And who are the people in our organization doing really effective work? And the last guiding question is, what's possible? Or do you have an invitation to collaborate, offer support, or a helpful connection? Also, you will see a 15-minute breakdown in your screen. And when we are close to ending, you will get an announcement that your breakout room will be closing. One housekeeping note. Once you are inside your breakout room, please remember the number of your breakout room or another person inside your breakout room. Why do we say this? This is just in case you lose your connection so you can head back to the main stage so our staff can help you navigate back to your room to rejoin the chat. So just remember, if you're having difficulty, refresh your browser. That will help you. And then if you need any help, our staff are there to help you. All right. So we will move to the breakout room. All right. We'll see you there. All right. Well, welcome back. And thank you guys for your great chat in your breakout rooms. I joined one and it's really good discussions going on. And I hope that you got to meet new friends in our East West Center Ohana too. So we really hope that these discussions will help us and help you also imagine and carry out your next big idea, a big action, or a collaboration with one another. So please keep in touch with the people you talk to. And also remember, you can message them directly in the chat box too. So now it's time for some Q&A. I would like to invite our facilitators to submit questions in the Q&A tab. And if you have another question, you can please welcome to also write it, but use the Q&A tab not the general public chat, because that's another set of people or another way. So please use the Q&A tab to write down your question. So one cool thing, if someone has asked a question you like, you can click the arrow button up to vote for that question to be asked. So, okay, our alumni experts will choose few of your questions right now. And alumni experts, over to you. All right, so we're waiting for, yes, great. Welcome back, James and Victoria. All right, so we let you choose the questions you would like to answer first.
Thanks. Let me just jump off, because I want to take them all as a single question first, and then we can get into the specifics of them. And they're all very good questions, and I would argue that while they're important questions, I also think we need to think about the non-urgent things that we should be doing, right? Because with this kind of problem, with a global pandemic about which there's not much known, if we focus only on the urgency questions, we de-emphasize, and again, obviously, I'm the planning. We de-emphasize the planning questions. Planning is not very good at, and this perspective is not very good on what do we do now that we learned something yesterday, right? It's good about setting up institutions to help manage resilience, to create resilience, so that when a new virus comes out, we have a set of institutions and things to do that help to kind of put parameters around its impact. But what we can take real time to do is to plan out what that might look like, because I do think that there's so little that's known about a virus that emerges, right? We know a lot about COVID now, but we're already 18 plus months into the pandemic, so it's too late, right? We've already had however many millions of people die. What can we do before that happens? Right? Because if you want to do a vaccine, you need a lot of genetic information. You need a lot of genetic information about that vaccine or about that virus before you can do anything, and that takes a lot of time. And that's the interim when a lot of the impact happens.
How to fold a towel. I need to learn how to fold a towel.
I'll echo you there, Jim. There were a couple comments in the chat about the importance of communication, and some very eloquent comments about it. And I also fully agree the importance of communication in the face of uncertainty, in the face of unknown disease. The knowledge about the condition are rapidly changing over time, from December 2019, when there was just inklings of social media in China, to finally getting more confirmation and more information. And I think, those countries and places that were able to communicate that uncertainty, I think actually, my hypothesis would be that they fared better, rather than trying to assert certainty in the face of something that's so uncertain. But yeah, I echo with what Jim was saying about the importance of recognizing that this is a very constantly evolving situation. With climate change, I think maybe a more slow moving train, and again, that uncertainty is still there as well. About, is it really happening, I guess, is what the naysayers will say, and then sort of the casting doubt about the certainty of the situation. Again, reinforcing the incredible importance of communication. There was another question, I think, from Dan Scollin about how do we communicate better with regards to related issues on habitat loss and climate change. And I don't think we've figured that out. Otherwise, we would already have solved the problem. And perhaps this is where the communication experts or marketing experts, or maybe children who are using social media in new ways, can help us to figure out how we can better communicate these issues. But I don't think we've figured this out, and I think this is a huge area for humanities development. So, yeah.
Great. Let me go to another question that's Amit Sen mentioned using incentives at a population level to induce increase in vaccination levels. And let me sort of share with you some of the conversation in our smaller group, where we heard a little bit about the experience in New Zealand and Singapore at the local community level. And what was so interesting in that is that that one of the successes in terms of the communications and the interventions in New Zealand, especially reaching sort of the lower income and harder to reach populations, was the employment and integration of a Maori and indigenous perspective, right? And having people who look like the communities that one is trying to engage with at the forefront of the campaigns, whether it's a vaccination campaign or education campaign, and even beyond that, it wasn't necessarily something that was an example, but the science itself, it needs to be cross-cultural, right? This is a global problem. The science itself should be cross-cultural, not simply because it sort of improves the science, but because it improves the trust in the science, right? And we tend to have, especially for people who are professional researchers and scholars and this kind of thing, we tend to have this sort of sense of a universal knowledge. And even if it is true, we can't expect that everybody believes that to be true. And I know from a number of different contexts that there's just a lot of mistrust of not just vaccinations, but just of anybody who's coming to tell somebody about not doing a tradition that they've done for generations, right? That's a much harder uh, hill to climb, I think, than the engineering of the solution, the technical solution. And there's another similar case from Singapore that in a much different context, but sort of some geopolitics between the Sinovac vaccination and the Pfizer vaccination, where people were asking for the Sinovac because it then allowed them to travel in the China geopolitics rather than the Western geopolitics. But that then again becomes a problem of implementation and reaching the community.
I completely agree with you, Jim. The importance of culturally competent approaches, culturally tailored approaches. And having lived in Washington, D.C. for 3 or 4 years working at a think tank, I never once heard that phrase uttered. And it was only coming to University of Hawaii as a faculty member where I felt my education got rounded out to really emphasize the issues of indigenous populations and using culturally tailored, culturally competent approaches as a way to build trust in the community. So I completely echo with what you said there. And I think that's also true for climate change as well. The ways in which knowledge is communicated and understood is so locally understood through even our own language, our own metaphors, the symbols, and even the myths of maybe our ancestors, how we connect to the past may also help us to connect to the future, and which is usually a little bit more right-brained than our typical science, which is very left-brained and a little bit dry, a little bit too universalist, objective, but bringing in that art of communication and those symbols that resonate with people, I think is really important.
Yeah. I see there's a question from Rosalind about endemic COVID. And, I don't have anything to say on that medically, but what I will say, there's just if you go back and look at some of the evolutionary biologists who talk about the 1918 flu pandemic, and particular, I forget his name. Is it University of Arizona, I think, and he's got a number of articles and popular kind of lectures that are just so interesting about how flu became flu. Right? It's not a foregone conclusion that humans have always lived with flu, but pandemic flu then was, it raged through horses first, and it went, I think maybe then it went to pigs, and then it went to humans after that, and then eventually it kind of became this thing that sort of petered out into this annual, nuisance more than anything else, even though it has serious impacts. But what I will say is that this whole thing has happened when I don't think we have any knowledge of this kind of stuff, right? Like there's one person that I was able to find who was out there telling people prior to COVID-19 about things like a pandemic, about disease, and the importance of our environment and the importance of history in creating immunity. And again, this has to do also with culture and geography, right? So if you have an epidemic where that kind of disease has moved forward from generation to generation, you develop a certain biology amongst your community that has the ability to react or in certain ways to it. But it's all just sort of new and reactive once we become aware of COVID.
My connection, I'm afraid, is a bit fragmenting here, but
All right.
looks like Oyanga has just jumped in at the right time.
Yes. All right. Well, thank you very much for your good questions, and thank you for the alumni experts for answering them. And I know with the limited time, we couldn't answer all of the questions. So again, East West Center is doing a routine discussion on these really critical issues. So please keep in touch with us and go into more deeper conversations later. So again, thank you for the alumni experts for joining us today and just inspiring us to find solutions for all these difficult issues. So thank you.
Yeah, thanks for the opportunity to talk to you all.
Yes, all right.
Thank you. Thank you all.
Okay, so we're going to end our core conversations with a bit of inspiration. This inspiration is coming from our EWC Innovation for Sustainable Development Fellows. So these fellows are young professionals and East West Center alumni who are under the age of 40 who work in the arts, environment, education, health, and disaster resilience sectors. So we included a few of the stories at the end of our core conversations to show how they're helping to change the world. So, okay, let's have a look at this Innovation Fellow video.
Atom Impact Academy for Sanitation Heroes is an East West Center innovation lab which aims to help young innovators to create and implement ideas to improve hygiene and sanitation facilities on medium-sized restaurants and street food.
However, there is a nature trading in this industry that could give a room to the unusual activities that could lead to the unhealthy and unsafety food sanitations.
And I want the youth potential in Samarinda can build the entrepreneurship ecosystem in here.
Хүүхдүүдийн өсвөр нас бол бие хүн болж төлөвшөх чухал үе байдаг. Энэ үед хүүхдүүдэд бие физиологийн болон сэтгэл зүйн хувьд маш их өөрчлөлтүүд бий болдог. Учир нь энэ үе хүүхдээс насан туршиж болох шилжилтийн үе юм. Олон улсын судалгаанаас үзэхэд COVID-19 цар тахлын нөлөөгөөр өсвөр насны хүүхдүүд сэтгэл санааны хувьд тогтворгүй, ирээдүйдээ итгэлгүй, түгшүүртэй, өөр бухимдалтай болсон гэх дүгнэлт гарсан байна. Энэ хямралын үед хүүхдийн сэтгэл зүйн эрүүл мэндийг хамгаалах улс орны ирээдүй болсон хүүхдүүдийг хөгжүүлэх зорилгоор Америкийн нэгдсэн улсын East West төв болон Ганабел институт Adaptive Teenagers хэмээх өсвөр насны хүүхдүүдэд зориулсан сургалт, коучинг уулзалт, номын хилцүүлэг зэргийг багтаасан цогц хөтөлбөр хэрэгжүүлэхээр болоод байна. Энэ хөтөлбөр нь хүүхдүүдийг өөрийн чадвар төлөвшөл, үнэлэлт хийх, зорилгоо тодорхойлох, цаг төлөвлөх дадалтай болгох, стрессээ зөв удирдах сурах, ном унших дадалтай болгох, ихтгэлтэй авах чадварыг хөгжүүлэх, мөнгөө хэрхэн зөв зарцуулах, мэргэжлийн чиг баримжаатай болгох зорилготой юм.
All right, what are inspirational stories, and thank you for all the fellows who are doing a wonderful job around the world. So you can learn more about our Innovation Fellows at East West Center today's session. So before you migrate back to the main stage, let's review the plan for the day. Okay, so we will now migrate back to main stage by clicking, let me just explain the boxes right now. So we will next move to EWC today's session, and it will be followed by the reconnection rooms by geographical and chapters. So we're looking forward for those 2 events coming up. So now we're going to migrate back to the main stage by clicking on the hamburger or the 3 dashes again and selecting 2021 EWCA International Conference at the top. See you over there. And once you're there, there will be a 5-minute comfort break. All right. We'll see you then soon.